Welcome everyone. I am looking forward to a jam-packed meeting to talk about, try and answer the question, when should I sell my practice? I'm going to share my screen here. Deciding when to sell your practice at this stage in your career is the biggest decision that you're going to make for the rest of your, likely for the rest of your life, the biggest financial decision you're ever going to make for the rest of your life. What I find surprising, and I've always found surprising, is that it's very unlikely you know how other dentists have succeeded in selling their practices and where they've failed. It is much cheaper to learn from somebody else's financial mistake than it is to make it yourself. So you're making the biggest financial decision you're going to make. What's at stake? The next third, financing the next third of your life is at stake. Your practice legacy is at stake. So we need to get it right. So my hope today is that we're going to share the experiences we've garnered over the past 30 years of business in working with dentists as they sell their practice and retire. A little bit about our firm, as my partner Mike mentioned, we manage $400 million for 113 families. 109 of those are dentists, and all but 6 have now sold their practice and are retired. So we have done this a lot. It's very likely that when you sell your practice, you're only going to do that once in your life. And have very little information about how your colleagues have done it. Over the past, I've been working now for 20 years. We have been through 1,000 files on the financial lives of dentists. As Mike says, I've written several books on the topic, and we've been trying for the past decade to educate as much as possible on what our experience is in what we're seeing, in how we're seeing dentists succeed. There's 2 areas in my business that I take the greatest pride in. The first is that in the 2000s, 95% of our clients were still in active practice ownership. Today, only 6 dentists in our client base still own their practice. So we have transitioned a large number of families out of practice ownership and into retirement. The second area I take the greatest pride in, or the second accomplishment I take the greatest pride in, is that we have never had to change a single client's cash flow in retirement. So it's our job to quantify how much a dentist can spend in their retirement lifestyle when they sell their practice. And in our 30 years of business, we have never had to change a single client's cash flow. We've now been through, the tech bubble bursting, we've been through the great financial crisis, and now we've been through a pandemic, and we've never had to change a single client's cash flow. Our eldest client is now 94 years old and is still living on the same amount of money we told them they could spend before they sold their practice. I take great pride in that. So deciding when to sell your practice leads into many other questions. And the first question, or your first goal, should be identifying when you're going to achieve financial independence. When we work with dentists, our goal is always to come up with a date of when they're going to achieve financial independence. Financial independence, as we define it, is the ability to work out of choice, not necessity. So I wanted to share a little bit about what we've seen, the typical life cycle of a dentist. And I'm hoping that you will recognize yourself somewhere along this path. Every practice owner is on a path. Eventually, you will be selling your practice. The typical dentist enters practice ownership in their 30s and then starts doing some retirement planning, makes some RSP contributions, maybe saves some money in their corporations. And for the next couple of decades, They focus on the practice as they should, and they do a little bit of retirement planning. What I can tell you is consistently at the age of 55, most dentists wake up and realize one morning, this retirement thing is actually going to happen to me. And I'll tell you why that is. The average dentist that we work with retires at the age of 62. That means, and I'll get into this a little bit later, that at age 58, they actually start living their retirement plan. At age 58, if you're a GP, you're only 8 recalls away from retirement. It's a short period. It's a condensed planning period. So it's no wonder that dentists often wake up at the age of 55 and they say, well, all this planning I've been doing for the past 20 years since I bought this practice, it's all been a fairy tale. This is about to get real. And the reason is because at age 55, you're likely only 3 years away from living your retirement plan. So our goal for the majority of the dentists that we work with is that they achieve financial independence by age 58. That means that they're in a position to sell their practice if they so decided at age 58. Many people want to work well into their 60s, but we want to have the opportunity or the choice to retire in case something happens like 2020. So let's talk about 2020. Here, I'd like to introduce Dr. and Mrs. Weir. I've worked with Dr. and Mrs. Weir for over a decade. Dr. and Mrs. Weir are some of the, they built one of the most successful dental practices in Canada. Dr. Weir and I have had some phenomenal conversations in the past that I was hoping that he could share some of his insights. Ian is one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life, and I felt like it would be more appropriate for Dr. Weir and Mrs. Weir to talk about how 2020 has gone for them, as opposed to me talking about what's happening with dentists in general in 2020, which you've all heard of before. Dr. and Mrs. Weir, maybe you could share with us how 2020 has gone for you, and also there are many attendees who are not familiar with the service that McNulty Group provides. So maybe you could give a little bit of insight. As I mentioned, Dr. and Mrs. Weir have been clients for over 10 years.
Thank you, Mark. I think we would all agree, everybody who's attending this Zoom webinar, this has been quite a year for us as dentists and for society as a whole. I'm reminded of the ancient Persian curse, may your life be interesting. And I think for all of us in this Zoom meeting, this has been an exceptionally interesting year. I'm sure we're all tired of hearing the COVID story, and I know I certainly am, and I'm going to try not to dwell on that. One of my pet peeves is what I call the CBSM, which is the COVID BS message that we get whenever we call a business or a pharmacy or whatever. We got to listen to a 5 or 10 minute diatribe informing us that in fact there is a pandemic amok in the world, and of course that's shocking news. And also that they really can't do their job properly because this pandemic has just totally hamstrung them with respect to being able to carry on whatever business they're doing. I've actually had business owners who I've challenged, and that includes some of the senior management at Mountain Equipment Co-op. I actually approached them and said, I think you're doing a terrible job running your business in the face of this pandemic. And they said to me, you have no idea what it's like to be doing our job in retail. And I listened to them as politely as I could for a while. And then I said, well, actually, I do have an idea. And every dentist in this Zoom meeting has an idea, because not only do we own and run businesses, but we work in a world of spit. And spit is where viruses like COVID thrive. And in fact, I, like many of you, have been working for the better part of 4 decades in spit that has been replete with HIV, SARS, H1N1, and now COVID, to name a few. So this is nothing new to us. And I think we do have a very keen appreciation of the impact of what this virus has done to all of us. We run a business with employees, landlords, business loans. We deal with WMIS and public health and directives from government and our professional licensing bodies, just to name a few of the things we've had to deal with in the last number of months. And I think we as dentists really have a very good idea what this was and is and all about. What we're actually doing is providing healthcare while having to keep everyone safe, including our patients, our staff, ourselves, and our families. And that's quite a task. My own personal situation has been doubly complex because at about the same time as COVID was rearing its ugly head, I came down with some medical scenarios that were potentially life-threatening and career-ending. And in February of this year, I sustained a deep vein thrombosis in my right leg, and I managed it on my own. I was pretty certain I had a DVT, but I managed it on my own at home because I didn't want to go in the hospital because of COVID. This was followed in June by a much worse thrombosis that forced me into the hospital, and in my right leg again, and then my left leg clotted in July. And this has had a pretty big impact on my ability to carry on activities of everyday life, and certainly had a huge impact on my ability to return to my practice, which I had planned to do, at least in a part-time manner. And over and above that, I've got a tumor on my thyroid that they found while they were investigating me for the blood clots, and so I have to have that biopsy next week. So it's been a busy year medically. And it's been a year that's been filled with all sorts of decisions and uncertainties. Even prior to COVID, I think most of us, even those of us with the busiest practices, have seen changes in the way our practices have been operating. We've seen reductions in patient flow due to an increasing dentist-patient ratio. We've seen the rise of corporate dentistry and all the variations in perceived practice values that have come along with that. The impact of the second wave, as Mark has mentioned, and how government and our college is going to respond to the second wave is still very much an unknown. But the privilege that I have had and my family has had is that despite all of these uncertainties, we've had a huge and critical area of our lives where we've had relative peace and certainty and very little anxiety. And that's where McNulty Group has come in for us. And many years ago, during my training as a senior anesthesia resident downtown in Toronto, I can remember the thought occurring to me as I was finishing my residency that very shortly I would be out on my own in practice. When you're under the supervision of a staff man or woman, if something hits the fan, you always have someone to turn to. And many times in anesthesia, those are life-threatening situations that you have to respond to quickly and hopefully very effectively. And it was a real eye-opener to me to get out into practice and be on my own and realize that the only person I had to turn to was myself. And I think that as dentists, we are trained to be very independent. I think all of us know this. A lot of us, I think, suffer with a bit of isolation, and we tend to rely on our own resources. When something happens in our office clinically, everyone turns and looks to us to make the decision and to act in an appropriate manner to rectify the situation. And so we tend to be quite independent, and we're professionally trained in what we do. But when we turn to the topic of selling a practice or facing retirement, massive uncertainties, I think, loom for most of us. Timing, valuations, legal and employee issues, all of these things are things that are of great concern. What should we do with the proceeds of our practice sale, and how do we live off of our investments? These are questions that we are not professionally trained to answer. And I personally pity those dentists who feel they need to tread this minefield of entering practice sale or retirement alone. When you're selling a practice and you're investing the proceeds, you need a responsible and knowledgeable and very agile team on your side. If you don't have this, I think you have a problem for which you need to find a solution. For me, it was an immense relief to turn these decisions over to somebody for whom this is charted territory. The McNulty Group, to my mind, are a group of professionals who have successfully assisted hundreds of dentists before me. And when so much of our personal and professional lives are filled with unknown pitfalls and anxiety, it's a great pleasure to have incredibly competent professional and personal advice, very personal advice that you can get from the people on the team at the McNulty Group. The chief characteristic I've noted about amongst some of the retired McNulty clients is that I noticed that they're all at peace with their financial situations and their financial futures. And that's not something I see in very many people. They've entrusted a lot of their life's most challenging decisions to this group of individuals. I'll tell you the most difficult decision that I had to make in the last 6 months was whether or not to return to practice. And I actively made that decision at a Zoom meeting with Mark and Mike present. So that's how important they are to my life and my decision-making process. I feel very fortunate that when life has become interesting, as it has for all of us, McNulty Group has been there to help us bring some certainty and peace in a pretty uncertain world. Mark, I'll turn it back to you.
I really appreciate that, Dr. Weir, Mrs. Weir. That means a lot to us. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I think people can relate. And as you say, dentists are pretty isolated, especially right now with everything that they have gone through. I know that there's, at certain times, anger, just pure frustration about what's been happening. And we seem to be getting back, just when we seem to be getting back to normal, cases start rising again, and we don't know what the future holds. So I appreciate you both coming on. For those of you not aware, Dr. Weir would be nowhere without Mrs. Weir building and running, one of the most successful dental practices in Canada. So I really appreciate both of you being here to talk about your experience and to shed a little bit of light on what it is we do. Thanks again.
Our pleasure.
Our pleasure, Mark.
When we talk about how we run our business, McNulty Group, I'll share with you the tools that we have built so that if you can bring them to your current advisors, so that you can take them if you're running things yourself. Our objective tonight is to share the experiences of your colleagues and let you know what we've seen work and what doesn't. Our hope is that will provide you with a little bit more security and reference points and benchmarks in some of your financial decision making, specifically around when should I sell my practice. Where our team focuses is solely on what we call the retirement paycheck. That's $12,000. The average dentist we work with spends $12,500 per month after tax, indexed for inflation. The reason I bring that up now is because answering the question of when should I sell my practice really opens up many other questions. One of them is, when will you be financially independent? And financial independence, as I've suggested before, means that you can work out of choice, not necessity. What it also means is that you have the ability to stop working and maintain your current lifestyle for the rest of your life. So all of the tools that you have at your disposal, all of the opportunities, including your practice, your savings, your pensions, everything that you have should be focused on one objective, as we do at McNulty Group, and that is increasing the probability of success of your monthly retirement paycheck. This picture, by the way, is of Dr. Cameron Ellis out of Carleton Place. I'm not sure, there may be some people on here that know Dr. Ellis. He gave me permission to share this picture because I thought it was perfect. This is the photo that his spouse sent out as an invite to his retirement party. Dr. Ellis has been a client for over 20 years. This is not Dr. Ellis's number, by the way. I would never share any of that information. But just the photo, I thought, captured exactly what it is we're talking about. Selling your practice, making that massive financial decision that's going to impact you and your family for the next 3 or 4 decades of your life is, in a way, a leap of faith. It's jumping into new waters, which is why I asked Dr. Ellis if I was able to use this photo. So all concentration should be on your monthly after-tax cash flow. And the way I recommend you start focusing your resources on that monthly after-tax cash flow is recognizing what business you are in. You didn't make it easy on yourself when you decided to become a dentist, when you decided to become a practice owner. You have a practice to manage. You have a practice to sell an asset that needs to be sold one day. You have more complicated cash flow and tax planning needs, and you have no pension fund. And when I say you made it hard on yourself, I'm comparing it to, you know, somebody earning a similar income at a public company somewhere. They'd have an entire human resources department dedicated to planning that person's exit and retirement. Here, you are solely responsible for all of these areas, in addition to your regular job, which is being a clinical dentist. I'm going to introduce Dr. Delansky in a little bit, but I know he's going to echo whenever he and I chat about practices and people selling their practice. The number one reason dentists sell their practice is to get out of staff management. It is very rare that I've ever met a dentist who just dislikes clinical dentistry. More often than not, it's getting out of staff management is the reason they want to sell. And that's why I talked about this triple cohort happening, that I believe that people who are financially independent in 2019, people who are financially independent in 2020, people who may have considered selling in 21, 22, they're all considering selling right now because staff management was the worst in their career in 2020. And that's the number one reason dentists sell. You have to manage your practice legacy and you have to manage your practice sale. You have to consider things like who's going to take over your staff. Is it the right buyer for your patients and your staff? You have to come up with complex corporate tax planning. How you're going to save the money, how you're going to optimize the money after tax when you sell the practice, and then you have to fund your monthly cash flow, which is that $12,500. And I'll just reiterate, $12,500 is the average monthly spending the clients of McNulty Group use to finance their lifestyle in retirement. Just as a reference point, when we talked about benchmarking, I'm going to be giving you some different numbers along the way. That's one of them. So in order to concentrate all of your resources on that retirement cash flow, you first need to recognize all of your responsibilities. I shouldn't say that because I know that you recognize that those are your responsibilities, but you need to get organized with those responsibilities. All of those areas that you are the CEO of. I want to be clear, and I've said it already, this is not an experiment. Selling your practice, you cannot work with people when in selling your practice or consider doing it yourself if you do not have the experience. The decisions you're making are going to last you for the next 3 decades. Some of the mistakes your colleagues have made, and I have seen this repeatedly throughout the 20 years that I've been in business. Some of the mistakes they've made when selling their practice is on the wrong path. The wrong path is where you put out feelers. You start, and I think Dr. Delansky will back me up on this. Once you start putting out feelers, but dentists often who own a practice, let's say a practice is worth $1 million, they start asking around to see if anybody in their study group might be interested, or they start talking to their dental supply rep to see if they might know of somebody who buys their dental practice. When you start putting out feelers, you are listing your practice. Dentistry is a very small community, and it will become very quickly known that your practice is for sale. And God forbid that gets back to your patients or your staff. So be very careful about putting out feelers. In fact, don't put them out until you're ready and you're organized to sell your practice. Working with inexperienced advisors is the #1 reason that practice sales fall apart. Accountants, I can think of numerous examples. One where the dentist buying the practice was his father was an accountant. and who had zero experience in buying or selling dental practices, and was giving advice on what most of us in the industry would consider cookie cutter planning, was questioning everything along the way that eventually just blew up the deal. Another significant problem is using disjointed advice. It's often the case that there is nobody looking at the big picture plan. You get advice from your accountant on tax planning. You might get advice from a practice broker like Dr. Delansky on what the practice is worth. You might talk to your investment person and or be given some plan that says, you know, you can spend X dollars when you retire, but you're still the person who has to bring all of this together. Disjointed advice at this time doesn't work. And a personal pet peeve of mine is when dentists attempt to sell their practice without a practice valuation. There is no reason except for trying to avoid a small relative fee for a practice valuation. There is no compelling reason to not have a practice valuation. You need to know by an independent third party, and again, I'm not a practice broker. All I do is retirement planning for dentists. All I do is manage dentists into retirement and manage their cash flows in retirement. So I'm not a practice broker, but you need a practice evaluation in order to make the right decisions, to know what you're dealing with. I can tell you, we had one client who had an offer by one of the dental service organizations, one of the corporate dentists, to buy their practice, and the offer was for $6.5 million. So I told them, well, let's go and get a valuation from a reputable broker, somebody like Tier 3, who Dr. Delansky is a partner at. And the client did not want to. I don't want to quote what a typical valuation costs, but let's say it's $10,000 on the outside. The practice was selling for $6.5 million, and this dentist didn't want to spend the $10,000, which I know it's much less, for a practice valuation. And as it turns out, when we got the practice valuation, it was very clear that the corporate dentist was lowballing the practice offer. $6.5 million was less than what we would have gotten. So pay the money for the valuation. We can't do planning without it. Those are some mistakes that dentists make. That's going down the wrong path. Again, I reiterate, I've mentioned every practice owner is on a path. I want to talk about the right path. The right path is you start by identifying the areas that you need experience and expertise. I suggested those 4 quadrants, or those four boxes on the previous slide. You need experience and expertise in each one of these areas. If you have that, and you determine if your current advisory group meets that criteria. If you have that, I strongly suggest the first step in discussing whether or not you should sell your practice is to get all of those advisors together so that you can coordinate. That is the right way to approach selling your practice. Get a valuation and have all of the advisors meet with the practice broker as well. In situations where McNulty Group is brought in, as I mentioned before, we are a group of specialists where all we do is practice and personal retirement planning for dentists. The way we go about doing that is first building a big picture plan and identifying when we should be selling the practice and creating a work back schedule to achieve what we want to achieve. Our sole focus is on the retirement paycheck. Our average dentist spends $12,500 a month after tax, indexed for inflation. When we're brought in, we really sit beside you in the CEO chair. So all of these boxes, all of the areas, and there's more to cover like human resources, etc., legal. We sit beside you as the CEO in all of your decision making. And we use the experiences we've garnered over the past 30 years, and I've been in the business for 20 years, the different situations where we've seen what works and what doesn't. So if you are interested, before I introduce Dr. Delansky, I'm going to outline exactly what you can sign up for if you are at this stage of life where you'd like to come up with a big picture plan to sell your practice with McNulty Group. First, as I mentioned, we'll create a big picture plan that's focused on the retirement paycheck. We'll work with you to assess which practice sale option is right for you. Again, we are not a practice broker, and we make no money when you sell the dental practice. And then we'll analyze sales alternatives and timing. We have, our clients have received many offers from corporate dentists. Excuse me. We have received many offers from individual dentists. We know most of the people that are involved, most of the advisors that are involved. One of the best things about having a homogenous client base is that all of the experts that work with dentists, at least one of them is working with one of our clients. So when a certain strategy, whether it be a tax strategy or a practice sales strategy or a pension strategy, whenever a strategy works for one client, because we have a homogeneous client base, we can overlay that strategy to every single one of our clients and see if it applies, and it often does. And by signing up for the practice sale plan, we can save hundreds of thousands of dollars of income tax. And the benefit here is that you remove staff management from your life. You can, if you like, continue doing the clinical dentistry. You enter a stage of your life where you have the freedom to design your day, month, and your year, and we can realize full value for your practice. Again, I want to be clear, we don't sell the dental practice, but under this plan, we can realize full value for your practice. And this is appropriate for any practice owner over the age of 50. You can gain more information by emailing us at info@mcnultygroup.ca. So the price of this is $1,150 plus the appropriate provincial sales tax, or HST rather. I'd like to move on to some specific case studies, but before I get that, I'd like to introduce everybody to Dr. Bernie Delansky. Dr. Delansky is one of the most well-known dentists in Canada because of all of his contributions to the various societies and associations. In addition to having a thriving endodontic practice, which he sold, I think sometime we were talking yesterday about over 15 years ago, Dr. Delansky moved into a new stage of his career, which was becoming a dental practice brokerage. And Dr. Delansky is now a partner at Tier 3 Brokerage, and somebody who I consider to be a very close friend and colleague, who I speak with regularly about what's happening with practice values, and we share what I'm seeing and what he's seeing. And we are seeing some interesting things, Dr. Delansky.
We are, Mark, but you left out the most important part of my CV. I'm also a multi-client.
Absolutely. I didn't get your permission to disclose that, but that's right. You're also a great McNulty client and have been one for over 20 years. Yeah. So, Dr. Delansky, I thought it would be great for us to have a conversation. Thank you for taking the time to join us to talk about what you're seeing in the market right now. But let's go back to how things went in March 2020. The COVID shutdown, not as much focusing on things that we all already know, which is, it was terrible and everybody shut down. What happened to practice values?
Well, a few things happened. One that is very paradoxical is it was an extremely difficult time, as both you and Ian have mentioned, for dental practice owners. You had all your overhead, your staff responsibilities, all these government programs to wade through, et cetera, et cetera. But what people sometimes miss is it was also a very, very difficult time for non-practice owners, associate dentists. Just to give you a little glimpse, we have a registry on our website at tier3.ca where people interested in buying practices can give us their information and we let them know when something that might interest them would become available. Well, the number of people who registered in April and May of 2020 was double the amount who registered the previous April and May in 2019.
Wow.
These are all people who were associates, maybe thinking about buying a practice. COVID pulled the trigger for them. So that's one paradoxical thing that happened. Interestingly enough, in the period pre-COVID was just about the highest prices I've ever seen for dental practices in the market. Huge demand, almost over the top demand. And of course, all that changed as soon as practices started or had to shut down. The corporate buyers probably had the most difficult time of all. Imagine owning 100, 200, 400 practices, none of them bringing in any revenue, you having to pay for the money that you borrowed plus all the overhead. Well, they obviously had a very, very difficult time. And
an individual practice owner's troubles times about 150, right?
Or 400.
Or 400.
Yeah.
Right.
So that was interesting to see, and they quickly let it be known that they would not pay the same prices. The
corporate dentists let it be known that they would not pay the same prices after COVID.
Exactly. Now, also imagine being one of the dentists that had sold to one of these corporations and had given an earnings guarantee.
Right.
You're on the hook for earnings that no longer are coming through the door.
Yeah.
So that was something that also happened in the marketplace. The banks, which up until March 15th had been literally climbing over themselves to finance dental practice sales, all let it be known that they were still interested. They thought dentists were great clients. They wanted their business, but. And we actually had some deals in the pipeline during that period. And bank financing was still available, but something where we basically have to do nothing as brokers to get bank financing suddenly became one of the most onerous parts of getting a sale closed.
I would say, and you know this story because it was actually with a mutual client, but for the first time in my career, a potential buyer of one of my clients' practices was actually scared away by the bank that they asked to finance the purchase.
Exactly.
Which is unbelievable. Like banks, for as long as I've been around, banks have been falling all over themselves to lend money to people to buy their practices, and now now some of them are scaring them away.
Exactly. Very, very different. That was highly unusual. I know the banker involved, actually. As brokers, one of our jobs is to know the bankers and the right people to finance the right deal. And we could have financed that deal, but as you know, the deal changed and one partner ended up buying out the other partner.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And by the way, that partner who's doing that has no problem getting bank financing.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to work at it now. So that's another thing that changed.
Right.
But as you and I have been discussing, Mark, the interesting thing is what's happened since June.
Well, this is what I find. So if you told me when in March, when the stock market we had the fastest stock market crash in history, the stock market dropped 38%, dental practices closed their doors. And now you're about to tell me that practice values are back to where they were pre-COVID.
They were back to where they were in 2019. I can't, in all honesty, say that they're back where they were in that crazy last quarter at first of 2019 for 2020. But on average, yes, they are back to where they were pre-COVID.
But I'll tell you, Bernie, my recommendation to the audience is to consider selling their practices now. And I'll tell you why that is, and I'm going to get to that in my next slide. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on where I am. I'm looking at this from a retirement planning perspective and from a retirement monthly cash flow perspective. Dental practices, the practice values went up for the past decade exponentially, right?
They were starting to level off a little bit, and then we had that take off at the end of the year last year. So
yeah, so practice values are a huge part of my clients' retirement assets, and I do not know what the next year holds. Do you?
I think we can agree that anybody who tells us that they do, you know the old story. How do you tell if a certain president is lying? His lips are moving.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So I guess my point is, if from my perspective, with the amount of stress that practice owners have been under, and I'm sharing my perspective for my client base. This may not be true for all the participants listening in tonight. From my perspective, the amount of stress that's been created in 2020, combined with the fact that there is still tremendous demand, Bernie, correct me if I'm wrong, for your dental practice. And if you're financially independent, or if we can get you financially independent, I think people would be surprised how close they are. Why continue to own your practice? Why not sell? Why not sell?
If they've met the goals that you mentioned earlier, and they're at that financial independence point when they sell their practice, I would tend to agree with you. Again, my opinion is, and Mark and I don't always completely agree, my opinion is that given the present circumstances, the value of practices is not going to go down, but the major phrase of what I just said is given the present circumstances. And I have to agree with you, Mark. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen next week, next month, 6 months from now. So yes, there is uncertainty.
So you and I are in agreement, which doesn't always happen. Now, I mean, another small point to make, because I want to move on to the next slide. And Dr. Lansky, if you don't mind, would you hang around for some Q&A after the presentation's done, to see if any registrants have any questions about practice values?
Absolutely.
The other concern that I have is something that you raised to me, is the changing of the service mixes. And for a GP practice, at least, that hygiene is a very valuable component that goes into the practice valuation. And if hygiene, if there's more dentistry being done, less hygiene, the ratio is changed. Is that correct?
That's correct. But let's be precise. That is a particular Ontario problem because of different directions from the licensing bodies for hygienists and dentists. So I know that some of my clients have had to alter their hygiene output because of that. And yes, hygiene, when you do the financial analysis, hygiene is the most profitable part of a general dental practice.
So for the listeners, bank financing is available but more difficult. Is that fair?
No, it's fair, but to be precise, it's available, but you now have to match the right banker with the right deal.
Okay. At least in Ontario, service mix is changing, which may affect practice values in the next year or so.
It may.
And tier three is currently valuing, if the practice has gotten back to around over 80% of pre-COVID production, they're currently valuing at pre-COVID prices?
No, what we're saying is that if your practice over the last 3 months that you've been open has got back to at least 80% of pre-COVID, and many of my clients are over 100% of pre-COVID year over year, but if you've gotten back to at least 80%, the banks are going to finance and the buyers are going to buy.
Excellent. Dr. Delansky, I really appreciate you taking the time. Can you hang around in case people have questions for you after?
Sure.
Thanks so much.
Just a quick reminder to everybody, if you do have questions, please just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and submit those, and we'll get those answered at the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Mike. From my perspective, there are a lot of dentists who have achieved a high level of financial success. What you're looking at here in these two pie charts is a retirement planner's perspective. Again, this is not, I am not a practice broker. We do not do practice valuations. We provide advice. We sit beside you in the CEO chair, if you will, when deciding when to sell your practice. But this is an actual case. I wanted to share with you a real case of a client who retired, sold their practice and retired in 2019. They actually continued to associate for the first into 2020 in the same practice, but they're one of the people who decided not to go back. They can afford to spend $165,000 a year after tax. And they're at their age 62, they had just under $3.2 million. This is very typical of a dentist that we work with. In this case, the dentist's practice was worth just over $1.5 million, and they could afford to spend $13,750 a month after tax. Now, to put that in perspective, I always find it comical when dentists envy teachers because they think teachers have such a great pension. And they do have a great pension, but that average pension is somewhere around $45,000 a year. The average pension of our client is $150,000 a year after tax. That's about $225,000 a year pre-tax. So $225,000 a year versus $45,000 a year is the comparison. So you have great opportunity, and this is where we were in 2019. However, when COVID hit and we had to shut down the dental practice, I've told you before that we have never had to change a single client's cash flow in retirement. That's because we need to be conservative. Our business is about being conservative and achieving the goals that we set out to do. So if that dentist wanted to sell after March 2020, we would have dramatically reduced the practice value, would have dropped to in order to be conservative, we assumed the practice value dropped to just under 1.11. Their RSPs dropped and their investment assets dropped by 10%. That shifted in a matter of months. That shifted their annual spending for the next 30 years from $165,000 a year to $138,000 a year. And we don't know if this is going to happen again. Again, I don't have any bias or conflict of interest in suggesting to you that you sell your practice. But I want you to have a picture that we don't know what 2021 holds for dentist practices. We don't know what it holds for your business. I'm suggesting that you get organized. If you're in a position, if you are financially independent, sell your practice. Sell your practice and associate. You don't want to risk having your retirement spending drop from $165,000 to $138,000 as it would have in this case study. This is a time you've worked, in Dr. Weir's case, he's worked 37 or 38 years in dentistry. Everything you've done up to this stage has been for your kids, for your patients, and for your staff. It's time to start focusing on yourself. And if you are financially independent, it's not worth, in my view and in my experience, it's not worth the risk of the unknown of what's going to come. Consider selling your practice. Often so that you can see what happened for the exact same situation if it was a matter of 4 months later. I do want to say, however, that you're not hurting yourself by continuing to own you're not hurting yourself financially by continuing to own your practice. The average mentioned before, there's two things that work in your practice. There's you and there's your money. So the money is what the practice is worth. So let's say that your practice is worth $1 million. Your investment return after paying you as the dentist, paying you an associate fee, your investment return is somewhere between 18 and 22%. So on a regular basis, you're earning, on an annual basis rather, you're earning at least 18.5%, likely 18.5% on average. So if not a worst case scenario, if a bad case scenario ensued and your practice value dropped by 10%, you would only need to work another 6.5 months to make that up. And you can see here, if it dropped by 30%, you'd have to work another year and 8 months to make up that money. I will, however, say from a lifestyle perspective, having to work a year and 8 months just to break even doesn't make sense to me. And that's why I think you should consider selling. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the $6 million dentist. I'm only going to spend a couple of minutes here. This is the average of 50 dentists that we work with. You should not compare yourself financially to how this group is doing. Your values may be different. They have sacrificed a tremendous amount, and they've achieved a very high level of financial success. But the average group, the average savings in this group is $5.8 million. The average retirement age for this group was 62. Again, this is a grouping of 50 dentists. And the average spending for this group was $180,000 after tax, $15,000 a month. We don't need the full $5.8 million to finance $180,000. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how this works. And the reason I'm going to talk about the nuts and bolts is to illustrate the difference or what you should be paying attention to when you speak to your advisors. If your advisor, what we often come across, dentists come into our office sometimes with financial plans done by banks that are this thick. I think they get paid by the pound or something. And it tells them that, yes, indeed, you can retire. They don't say how you can retire. It's nice. It's a nice, warm and fuzzy feeling to understand that you've saved a lot of money, but you can do a lot of the math on a bar napkin. I want to share with you what dentists lack and what the wealth management industry, because it doesn't specialize, what it lacks is giving dentists an idea of the nuts and bolts of how this is going to work. So the reason we've never had to change a single client's cash flow in retirement is because of the 4-year reserve. So for the average, for the $6 million dentist, we have $4.15 million in income generating strategies, whether those be dividend paying stocks or bonds. We have that $4.1 million is generating an income that's going to be far and above the $180,000 a year. We put 4 years of cash flow, we set 4 years of that $180,000 a year plus tax aside in short-term instruments. And the reason it's 4 years is because there is almost no 4-year period in history where the stock market would have remained in a negative position. So if we have $4.1 million in income generating strategies, we know with certainty that at certain times the stock market is going to crash. But we're not at risk of the stock market crashing. We're not at risk of selling out. We just need to be sure that we don't have to sell to finance your lifestyle. So by putting the 4-year reserve in place, we set aside your lifestyle for 4 years, allowing the rest of the money to breathe. So a 2008 stock market crash happens, we use one of the 4-year reserves and to let the rest of the money come back, the portfolio come back. The second year, the portfolio is still not back to even, so we use the second year of the 4-year reserve. By 2011, the portfolio is already at a profit, and it's able to start paying back those 4-year reserves. That's the key to success in retirement income planning. I'm going to quickly move on to the checklist of when should I sell my practice. Unfortunately, we're starting to run out of time already. So feel free to email us for copies of this presentation. The answer to when should I sell my practice is really just a grouping of more questions. And you can ask for, I've written down the articles that you can email and ask us for. We've written about all of this before. The first thing you need to know before you sell your dental practice is, are your children going to need any more financial support? I've written before that it's a hard time for our children right now. It's a hard time to gain financial success, and they may need you to work a little bit longer. The second question is, can I fund my lifestyle without my practice income? That $12,500 a month after tax index for inflation is how we do it with the 4-year reserve and the income generating strategies, but you need to quantify that before you can answer, when should I sell my practice? How much do I need? This is a slide. How much you need depends on how much you have in tax deferred vehicles like corporations and RSPs. This is a slide I'd recommend that you email info@mcnultygroup.ca to get. This gives you a rough idea at different spending targets and different tax deferred amounts of how much you can spend. What kind of legacy do you want to leave? That affects your who you want to sell the practice. What will my practice sell for? Get a practice valuation. How can I minimize tax when I sell my practice? You got to talk to your accountant about purifying your corporation so that you get the capital gains exemption, potentially multiply that by yourself, your spouse, and a couple of your adult children. How will I get money out of my taxable accounts? You need to know how you're going to be financing that $12,500 a month after tax. How you still owe tax on money inside your corporation, inside your RSPs. How should you sell? Should you sell it on your own? Should you use a practice broker? Should you use a dental practice consolidator? How to finance your monthly cash flow after you sell. What are the nuts and bolts of financing your monthly cash flow? When you're ready to sell, the decision comes down that we have a few more tips. First, you need to decide what type of sale. And when I said before, the practice sale plan mentioned before, we help you work through this. I would say the way that you sell is the first decision. For most of my clients, I recommend selling and associating. This eases them into retirement. For most of my clients, I do not recommend a corporate dentist, selling to a corporate dentist, because in most cases, they still are on the hook for doing most of the work. I have some small tips at the bottom here to increase your planning at a stage when you're getting close to selling your practice by 4 times. We have some tools to increase the number of times you check and recheck. When you're making a decision that's going to last you for the next 30 years, you need to increase the number of times you're checking to make sure that decision is correct in your spreadsheets. You have to put the right tax structure in place, and we recommend that clients put in a trial retirement. Before our clients sell their practice, we start sending them $12,500 a month to fund their lifestyle to make sure that it works. You have spent 3 to 4 decades in practice ownership. It has created in 2020 a great deal of stress. You have achieved very high levels of financial success. I'm recommending to you all of your focus should be on your monthly cash flow, and you should consider selling your practice today, or at least getting a valuation to consider selling your practice today. I'd like you, if you don't mind, as one of the attendees, to share your story with us. As you can see, one of my objectives is to get as much information from dentists as possible about their finances so that we can help educate other dentists without disclosing any of the personal information. The more averages we can get, the better. So please email me directly with any interesting story you might like to share that might be of use to your colleagues.